Hello, dear listener. This is Jay Biedenhorn, rector at St. John's Episcopal Church in Memphis, Tennessee, located at the corner of Central and Greer. If you have found us, we are glad that you are tuning in today to catch the first in a two-part series of Dr. Mitzi Minor, who is a New Testament professor at the Memphis Theological Seminary and a fantastic teacher and such a resource for our city. Dr. Minor joined us on December the 8th and began her two-part series as we began to discuss Mary and Elizabeth and what was truly at stake for these two women and their courageous acceptance, their courageous willingness to be a part of the great gift that is given in Advent. Dr. Minor will be with us again this coming Sunday, December the 15th at 9:15 a.m. Plan to join us if you are in town. We always have coffee and donuts and conversation, and count on the second part of this teaching being posted next week. I hope you and yours are having a joyful Advent season. Come see us sometime.
I think it was Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, a great Jewish thinker, if that name doesn't mean much to you, but a very, very wise human being, once said, one of the important things in life is to make sure that you know what you see rather than to see what you know. I love that quote, and it has application in lots of settings, but I'm using it today because, here we are in Advent celebrating a story and that's a part of our faith that most of us know really, really well. And so well, in fact, and particularly the primary parts of the story. We got angels and shepherds and wise guys and barns and mangers, and all of it. We know those parts of the story so well that what can happen to us is that we see what we know when we take a look at the story, and therefore miss some parts of the story that are also there and also significant. So what I'm going to do for a couple of weeks is point out some of those places in the stories that don't get the kind of attention that most of us give to those stories, and have a chance to explore the wisdom that is there with us. What we're going to do is explore those things and hopefully take some gems from what have been handed down to us that enhance the season of Advent and then our celebration of Christmas as it comes to us, okay? So let me start by reminding, for many of you this is a reminder, for some of you this may be new, but I am a huge believer in the importance of paying attention to context when we take a look at any biblical story. We're talking about, when we're talking the New Testament, we're talking 2,000 years ago in a different culture and a different language. Think about your college or high school lit classes where you had to read Shakespeare. And wasn't that fun? And at least initially, for me at least, Shakespeare got a little easier as I read more in it, but initially it's like, what? And this was, a white European writing in English 400 years ago. We're talking about a text 2,000 years ago, different culture, different language, and so all of you, I would bet my house that all of you have at some point tried to read something in the Bible and go, I don't know what I'm reading. I wish I did. I think it might be important. Somebody told me it was important. Maybe it's important, but I'm damned if I know what it is, right? So I'm giving you permission to feel that way right now, okay? So you're not like a bad Christian because you've ever had, those feelings. It is hard, and those are the reasons why. So to pay attention to context is to help us sort of situate the stories there and give us some insight to that we wouldn't normally have. My favorite illustration of the importance of context has to do with the vacation trip. Eileen Farmer was on this vacation trip. I was telling Donna, by the way, when you travel with someone they know too much about you, so I'm very grateful for Eileen's sort of, as Donna said, she's a priest, so she's really good at confidentiality. I'm grateful for that. But we were staying if any of you, we went to Maine, which is one of my favorite places in the entire universe, and we were staying in what's called Down East Maine, but it's actually north a little bit, off Highway 1, again, if any of you have ever been here, and near a fishing village, lobster fishing village. And on our way to the house we rented, we had to drive past this place called the Barren View Golf Course. And we just laughed and laughed. We thought, why, if you have a crummy view, would you advertise it? You know, and so the way we were situated, we had to drive past that nearly every day when we were going somewhere over there. Well, about the middle of the week, we'd come to understand that we were staying in Washington County, Maine, which advertises itself as the wild blueberry capital of the world. And wild blueberries grow not on bushes or in that, but in I would call it scrub grass. They probably don't. This is another thing, not being a Mainer, I don't know. But it grows on this scrub grass that takes over areas where glaciers have dropped boulders so farmers can't farm. And so they just let it because it ends up being a great crop for them they don't have to work for it. But the interesting thing is that scrub grass in autumn turns an incredible crimson color. And like the whole hillsides, you know, will be this crimson. And I have photographs, it's incredible. And so now, and you know what they call those places where it turns crimson or where that scrub grass grows, they call those, wait for it, barrens. Okay, so once you understand the context, the name of the golf course, the Barren View Golf Course, makes perfect sense. And that's the power of context, you know, when you know those things. Like somebody coming to Memphis and, you know, visitor and say, you want to go to Mud Island? No. It does not sound like fun, you know, and so, see, context. So we're going to pay a little attention here at the beginning to context to help appreciate the story I want to explore with you today. It is a story about women in the Christmas stories. Next week we're going to do the guys, and you know, and so that way we'll include everybody as we do this. But today is stories of women, which is itself surprising, because the first century world was one of those places, as most cultures had been until recently. It was a man's world, patriarchal world, so that women were there to produce legitimate male heirs. As one of my students said once, they were baby ovens in that context. So they were not important, and so the very fact that stories have come down about these women is itself remarkable. So to explore just a little bit, the first century world, talking in Israel, first century, what today we call the Middle East, probably more accurate to say the first century Mediterranean world, was controlled by the Roman Empire. Some of you will remember that from your world history classes way back when. And so they lived, Israel was a conquered and occupied country. And Roman rule made life very difficult for 90% of the population. You know, we have a phrase today about how the other half lives. In that world, you could talk about how the other 10% live. And there was no middle class. So it is literally the 10% of those who are powerful, wealthy, and privileged. And then there's everybody else, okay? So there's no middle, there's no like grades. There's the haves and the have-nots in that world. And Roman rule, of course, if you're part of the Roman rulership, then you're part of the haves. And life was difficult for the other 90% of the population. And when I say difficult, I mean economically, politically, socially, it was difficult. And even more so if you were a woman in that world. So it's a tough time. And I don't want to imply that people there lived with the trauma of Roman occupation every day. You know, every day didn't have a horrible something happen. But they lived with the reality of Roman rule every day. It really made life challenging. So here's a data thing to convey this to you, okay? Our best understanding is that that life expectancy for that upper 10% was 60 to 70 years. That's close to where we are, in our time. So 60, 70. Life expectancy for the other 90%, 30 to 40 years. Okay? That's a dramatic difference in what was going on with their lives. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. And for women, it was even more challenging. Not least of which is because of childbirth. Very dangerous, in a world like that. In addition, the culture, and this is relevant here, was what today, they didn't call it this, but what today we would call a shame-honor culture. Now, to contrast that with us, ours, you know how you get people to change behavior or to conform to appropriate behavior in our culture? When I tell you, you're going to all go, oh yeah, that's exactly what we did. We are a guilt culture. And so y'all are laughing, you know this, right? How many of your parents were really good, particularly your moms, right? Moms go to school somewhere and sometimes to learn how to, hopefully use, that. My mom was great at it. And I say that with deep affection, with that. But that's how we do it. First century culture didn't. They were not an introspective culture. We had to have Freud come along and teach us really to do that. Okay? So they're not an introspective culture, and they weren't a guilt culture. It was about shame and honor. And so if you conducted yourself appropriately, then what you did was you honored your father. This was, again, man's world, right? And fathers were heads of households. And everybody in the household was supposed to behave appropriately so that they would demonstrate that the father was an honorable man and had taught his family and servants, etc., how to behave appropriately, and then the family shared in the honor of the father. And if you didn't, then you were shamed into it. Today, we actually frown on public shaming, and with good reason. But in the first century culture, that's how they worked. And because public shaming is awful, it's a pretty good deterrent, to keep you behaving appropriately. And so all of this is relevant as well. Okay, so honor is wrapped up in the father, in the head of the household, the family. And so, for example, if you were born into a family that was considered a dishonorable family, you're going to carry that, even though you didn't do a thing. You just happened to be born into this family, but it doesn't matter. That's how that culture operated. Again, quite different from ours. And so in this setting, where a woman's primary job, from the culture's perspective, was to produce legitimate male heirs. Here are the legitimate, okay? Legitimate male heirs. How do you know if a child or a son, because that's what we're talking about, is a legitimate heir in a world without DNA tests and blood tests? She has to be a virgin when she gets married, and then no other man can have access to her after she's married. In some provinces in the Roman Empire, I don't know that Israel fell into this, but in some provinces in the Roman Empire, there are actually laws about how often a married woman could be seen in public in a given period of time. And you never went in public without male chaperone, if you're a woman at all. Okay? The other thing to remember is that this is also a world that didn't know anything about being an adolescent. Really, Western culture, starting in the 20th century, invented adolescence. Good or ill, you can weigh that. Some of you may be parents of teenagers and you're going, what were we thinking? But joking aside, it's thank God, because what happened prior to the 20th century is that somebody growing up in that world, you were literally a child one day and you're an adult the next day. And of course, they prepared them for that. This is the world they knew. This is the life that they knew. And so they understood this, okay? And so a young woman, as soon as she's able to bear a child, is now an adult. And a young man, we're really talking from our perspective, boys and girls, but from their perspective, young men, as soon as they're able to provide for family. So their learning from their father, is completed and they can become whatever their father was, because that's how that worked as well. Okay? And And so, very young ages, they took on these kinds of adult responsibilities, and how well they performed them, how appropriately they lived out these roles, ended up reflecting on the honor of the family, and particularly the honor of the father. Okay? Now, what this means for the women in this world is that a woman's sexuality was essentially owned, first by her father, who needed her to be a virgin in order to arrange a marriage, and I'll talk about that in just a second, and then by her husband, because, he enters into marriage with her in order to produce a legitimate heir. So, for one thing, we need to do, whenever you read about any situation of marriage in the Bible, period, our ideas about falling in love and finding a soulmate and a life partner, let those go. It is irrelevant when you're talking about the first century world. Marriages were arrangements between honorable families, honorable fathers actually, and they were done for economic reasons. And they were done in order to produce that male heir who would take over, the family business, estate, whatever that would be. Now, that does not mean that spouses didn't come to love one another. We have evidence in Scripture, in fact, of that actually happening. It doesn't mean that the family didn't operate lovingly. Many times they did. I hope that was the norm. But that's not why they entered into those marriage relationships. These were economic arrangements. They happened, by the way, when the top 10%, as soon as a family had children. So this family has a daughter, and this family has a son, and they're, 7 months old, and the marriage is arranged. To make sure that the economic realities of those two families is protected. And so, from the time they're 7 months old, this is who they're going to marry, or 4 months old. I just pulled 7 out of the hat, right? If you're a peasant, if you're that other 90%, you waited until the young man and young woman were of childbearing age. And you know why they waited? Because there's no guarantee that those children are going to live into adulthood. That's how difficult life was. Our best understanding is half of the children born to the other 90% did not live to their 16th birthday. Man, is that tough or what, right? So, all of that is the context for us to read some stories this morning about two of the women who show up in our Christmas stories, okay? So, Luke chapter 1, and much of this is going to be familiar to you, but I'm going to get us to focus on parts of this that we often know, okay? All right, so Luke chapter 1. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah. I don't know about you all, but I don't know. I care what priestly order he belongs to. But this was, this is an honorable man within this context, right? That's how it works. His wife was descended from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. Now, what we're going to find out is that Zechariah is a village priest. He's not a high priest. So they are the other 90%, okay? But within that context, their bloodlines are pretty doggone good, okay? He's from a priestly family. She is from the family of Aaron, who is Moses' brother. And so that's, in that world, the bloodlines are high, circumstances. And then we get this. Both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. So not only are their bloodlines outstanding, their conduct is outstanding. They have behaved appropriately. They are faithful people. They are just people. They have kept covenant with God. Do you read that? According to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. First of all, do you believe that? But second of all, hyperbole, and that's what this is, exaggeration to make a point. And the exaggeration to make a point is to say, these are really, really good people. These are the people you wanted to be your next door neighbors. These are people you wanted to, to have on your friends list. Okay, good people. And that's why the next verse is an absolute shock, or would have been to a first century audience. But, isn't that a funny word sometimes? Little 3 letters, you know, and just turns everything around. You ever had somebody say, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but what are they about to do? They're about to hurt your feelings. So it just turns the whole thing. And that it does this. Here are these really, really good people. But they had no children because Elizabeth was barren. And both were getting on in years. So I hope, against the background of what I told you, you can see why Elizabeth's barrenness was such a big fat hairy deal. Right? I mean, the one thing, again, from the cultural perspective, the one thing she was here to do, she had not been able to do. And that made her, in the minds, again, in terms of the culture, worthless. And again, that doesn't mean that Zechariah didn't care about her, or that she didn't have friends in the village who, cared about her. I'm talking culturally speaking, that made her worthless. And the perspective would have been that she must be barren because God is mad at her, or her family. That somehow they had dishonored God, and so God is shaming them by making Elizabeth barren. And that's why the introduction to them made the note about their barrenness so stunning. Because they had kept all the commandments and regulations of the Lord. But they couldn't. And so a first century audience would have been like, what? That's not how this works. Okay? Have you ever noticed, just as an aside really quickly, we have all these rules that don't work? Y'all ever notice that? We decide things are us and then they aren't, right? And so this is one of those moments, right? So that sets up the story that now follows. And again, you may know this part of the story, but Zechariah was chosen by Lot. So, what again, I won't go into detail about this, but the village priests rotated service in the temple in Jerusalem. They would go there, I actually don't know how long, let's say a couple months, and then they would go home and serve in the village, and then they would go back when the next vacation came around. And you know what they got to do? They got to do the grunt work. The high priests are not going to get their robes dirty, slaughtering lambs for sacrifice, right? So, the village priests get to go and do the grunt work. That's how that would work. So, Zechariah's a village priest, and he was serving in the temple while verse 8 says, while his section's turn of duty had come up. That's how we know about this rotation. And so, we're rocking along with this story. Here are these people, we're shocked. Zechariah is doing what he's supposed to do. He's rotating in to serve in the temple. He gets chosen by Lot. You draw the short straw or the long straw, or maybe they threw dice. I don't know, but they did something that selected a person. And again, the perspective would have been, whoever got the short straw or the long straw or whatever it was, that was God sending out a blessing. And this guy shouldn't be getting a blessing because his wife is barren. And so surely they have done something. Okay? And so this shouldn't happen. But he was chosen by Lot and to make the offering on Yom Kippur, is what this is, the Day of Atonement, the one day in all the year that a Jewish priest gets to walk into the Holy of Holies to make sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people. It's a high honor for this to fall on you, particularly on those village priests who don't get to do the high honor things. And it fell on Zechariah. And again, a first century audience would have been, what the heck? They're barren. There's something off here. Okay? But he goes in, to make the offering as he should have done. And you may know this part of the story. While he was there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar of incense. Don't you always want to notice the right side, not the left side? I love the details, right? And when Zechariah saw him, he was terrified. Look, I don't know what the model for those little precious moments cherubs were that you may have in your house, but it was not the angels in Scripture because they just scare people to death. You ever notice that? So he is terrified. And of course, again, because we know the story, what we find out is that he and Elizabeth have been chosen. And they are going to have a son. And they will name him John. he will lead his people back to God in preparation for the coming of something even greater. Okay? And so again, from the perspective of the first century world, this is a mind-boggling story because they're barren. God has punished them. There is something. It might have been Zechariah's father. It could have been Elizabeth's father. Somebody has done us something. And we don't like those people. And don't you know in that little village where they live, that people talk about them? Because that's not just a southern thing, right? Right? I mean, people just do that. And they talk about it. And on days when they needed to feel good about themselves, they would be, well, at least we're not barren. Right? You know that is happening. And so, here is this chosen by light. An angel appears to him. The message is, you are going to have a son. You will name him John. He is part of what God is doing to fulfill promises that God has long made. Just a stunning story. And this particular piece of it ends this way. In chapter 1, verse 24, it says, and after those days, that means after he went home, after his section's rotation was done and he went home, his wife Elizabeth conceived. And she remained in seclusion for 5 months. And she said, this is what the Lord has done for me in this time, when God looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people. We could translate that, took away the shame I have endured among my people. You know what I hope about that verse? Notice she talks about the shame comes from the people, not from God. I hope Elizabeth always knew that God was not punishing them, that God was not shaming them. I hope she always knew that. But this statement is about what God has done to take away the shame she'd endured among her people. Okay? So that's chapter 1 in this story. All right, so that's the first woman in the story. The second woman, of course, is Mary. So in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth. Now, for you and me, Nazareth is kind of the center of the universe. That was not true in the first century world. Okay, Nazareth is a small place. Nazareth is a place you go, and you don't have cell phone service. Okay, it is off the beaten path. Here, an angel of the Lord has shown up there. Okay, angel of the Lord shows up to a virgin. The English translation says, engaged to a man whose name is Joseph. They're not engaged, they are married. The marriage has been arranged. What has not happened yet is the homegoing. In the New Testament, the wedding is the moment when the bride, or the wife, she's actually already the wife, goes home to live with her husband. For us, the wedding is when the marriage begins. Not true. The marriage is arranged by the fathers. And once that is arranged, they are married. The wedding is when she actually goes home to live with him. And it may have to do with, him needing to finish an apprenticeship or, construct a living quarters or something like that. It may be a week, it may be 2 weeks, maybe a month. It's not real long if you're peasants. But she's not engaged. They're already married. We just don't have an English word for this. So the best that the translators can do is engaged, right? So she's married already to Joseph. She just hasn't gone to live with him yet, all right? And so this angel appears to this woman who, notice, to a virgin married to Joseph. So that's how we know this is between the arrangement and the homegoing. And her virginity at this point does not indicate, as we've often done in Christian history, some kind of special holiness. It is the normal course of events. She should be a virgin at this stage of this journey, or her family, her father is not an honorable man. But it doesn't indicate some special, there's no aura, because she's particularly pure or something along those lines, right? This is her. And again, because of the time, we're talking about somebody who's 13, 14 years old, which is also mind-boggling for us, right? All right, so she's there, and this angel of the Lord appears to her. First century audience's jaw is on the ground. Because she is a nobody in that world. Again, for us, Mary is such a part of the story. And so we have centered her, but in the first century world, she's a nobody. A peasant girl living in the out-of-the-way place in the Roman Empire that nobody even knew. It's like 3 times, if those of you who read Louise Penny, it's not even on the map. Okay? But an angel of the Lord has appeared to her. And of course, we know what the angel of the Lord says to her. The initial words, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." The Lord is with a peasant girl. In 3 times. In the first century version of 3 times. In Nowheresville, God has taken notice. And God has reached out to this young woman. And what, of course, the angel tells her is she is invited to be a part of what God is doing to fulfill promises long made. So we get to the end of this story. I want this part of the story. Gabriel tells her about the fulfillment and what God is inviting her to be a part of. And she, of course, says, "How's this happening?" Because, nothing's happened yet. How's this happening? And he tells her that God will overshadow her so that what happens within her being, her body, will be holy. And finishes that particular statement with, "For nothing shall be impossible with God." That's verse 38. Verse 39, Mary said, "Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." I figure that there was actually a long pause between verse 37 and verse 38. Because for all the reasons that I've just described to you, for this young woman to turn up pregnant in this moment, do you see the implications? Not just for her. Her father, her family of origin, the marriage arrangement with Joseph and his family, all of this is going to be impacted. Mary's life is going to be impacted because of the way the cultural dynamics happen. Now, verse 39, and here's the piece that we often don't see. "In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth." Here's what we don't see. Nobody in this world traveled with haste. There were no buses, there were no trains, there weren't even bicycles. If you are going to travel, and by the way, most peasants didn't. Most peasants did travel 50 miles from their place of birth in their entire lives. You don't travel in haste. If you're going to travel, you have to make arrangements because travel wasn't set. Like I said, you don't buy a bus ticket, you don't buy a train ticket. You have to work at it. And particularly to ensure that travel is going to be safe and secure. Nobody travels in haste. Mary travels in haste. And notice what we aren't told. We aren't told that anybody went with her. We aren't told that plans were made for her. The journey is 75 to 80 miles is our best guess. We don't really know where the village is that Elizabeth and Zechariah lived, but it's in Judea. It's near Jerusalem. So we can guess 75 to 80, maybe 75 to 90 miles, and she's going to have to walk it. Imagine again how dangerous this is. And it's not again like, you got maps. You don't, right? And so we aren't told about arrangements or anybody going with her or somebody going with her to make sure she's safe. We aren't told any of that. Now maybe Luke just doesn't tell us. But it's more likely, it seems to me, that what Luke is doing at this point is looking at his audience and saying, you know what this is because you know what happened. When she turned up pregnant when she shouldn't have been, there is every possibility that her family kicked her out. This is how a father restores the honor of his family. He boots out the offending one to show that he is in fact an honorable man, and the honor is restored to the entire family. And there's every possibility that that is what has happened here. And at this point, Mary undertakes this journey, difficult and dangerous because she has nowhere else to go. And she goes to Elizabeth because Gabriel, the angel, had told her, oh, by the way, this is what's happened to your relative Elizabeth. Mary and Elizabeth may never have met. Again, most peasants don't travel. So Elizabeth may be a part of the family lore or something like that. But there's a good chance they've never met, or if they had, maybe once. Maybe Mary's family made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem at one point, and if they did, they would likely stay with relatives. So maybe on one of those pilgrimages, she had met Elizabeth, maybe, but that would have been once. So it's not like, how many of you got a favorite aunt or a favorite cousin? It's not that, right? So Mary takes out, because she has nowhere else to go, undertakes this journey. I always say to my students, how long do you figure it took her to walk 75 to 90 miles? And we usually settle on about 4 days. Maybe 3, because they could walk for, they were much more physical, in activity than we are. So maybe 3, but probably 4 days. Man, can you imagine? So what I want you to think about now is when she gets there. Remember, it's not like she could call Elizabeth and go, I need a place to come and rest up for a few days. Not like you do it actually. Right? And so that means she's going to show up on Elizabeth's front porch unannounced to a relative she may not know. And that's if she gets there, which fortunately she does. And she has no idea how she's going to be received. Elizabeth has just gotten past her own shame. Maybe Elizabeth is going to be, you can't be here. I've just gotten past this myself. So try to stand with Mary on that front porch, or whatever the first century equivalent, right before she knocks on the door. When she does not know what's going to happen. Can you even breathe? And doesn't that make Elizabeth's role in this story crucial? If Elizabeth says you can't be here, where's she going now? And we know Elizabeth doesn't. Difficult experiences can do maybe multiple things, but maybe we could divide them broadly. They can harden you, or they can soften you. And Elizabeth has clearly allowed what had happened to her to soften her. So what she does is she welcomes Mary and blesses her and apparently listens to her. By the way, can you imagine Mary telling this story? Who's believing this story? The answer is Elizabeth believed the story. Have you ever been in that situation where you need to tell somebody this happened to me, and somebody listens and doesn't? You've lost your ever-loving mind. They don't do that. They hear what you've been through and hear what your experience is. Maybe they put their hand on your arm, maybe on your cheek. I'm here for you. We're going to get through this. Man, doesn't that make all the difference in the entire world? When somebody does that? So Elizabeth's role for me becomes crucial in this story when we pay attention and learn a little about context and then read it not through eyes that already know, but read it through eyes informed and able to see what is there. She's a hero in this story. The welcome, the blessing, the hearing, and Mary stays with her for some months. Now, what happens afterwards, we don't know. Mary gets to go home. They may well send word, however they do that, caravan or whatever, that Joseph, Matthew tells us Joseph has gotten his own visit from an angel. And so Joseph is able and willing to take her in despite everything. But Mary doesn't know that as she's standing on Elizabeth's porch. And because of that, Mary is going to sing one of the great songs in Scripture. My soul magnifies the Lord. My My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. For God has looked with favor on the English translation to say something like the lowliness or the lowly state. It should be translated, God has looked with favor on my humiliation. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is God's name. She says that after she's been booted out of her family for reading the story. Being blessed does not mean everything's going swimmingly, which is how we often talk about it, right? Being blessed is getting to be a part of what God is doing. Mary gets to be that. And Elizabeth's support and welcome really makes that possible. So friends, here's an Advent challenge for you this week. Maybe there's going to be a call for you this week to be as courageous as Mary was. For Mary to say yes. Denise Levertov has this marvelous poem called Annunciation. You can Google it if you're interested. But in the poem she says, we're always told of meek obedience. No one mentions courage. Well, they ought to mention courage. And maybe at some point this week, you're going to be called on to do something courageous. At work, as a parent, as a member of the vestry here. And, I don't know what walk of life, but maybe there's going to be a moment when you are going to be called on to do something courageous. Not enormous. It may not be earth-shattering. It may not get you in the newspaper or on Instagram, or that's more. When I mention newspaper, I'm telling my age. Right? It may not get you, a thing on Facebook or any of that stuff. But for you, it's this moment. Am I going to do this or no? Maybe that happens for you. If it does, then let me encourage you to remember Mary in this moment when she says yes to God. This vulnerable nobody, according to that culture, who is willing to say yes to God, even though the consequences are significant. So there's your model for courage. But I'll bet, whether something courageous is called forth from this week or no, and I kind of hope it isn't. Those are hard moments, right? Right. So I'll be, let's be honest. We hope that happens to Jay. But there's every possibility that there's going to be a moment this week when you need to be somebody's Elizabeth. When you need to be kind and welcoming. When you need to listen and receive what you hear and not think somebody's crazy. And be willing to be their Elizabeth. That would be one of the most significant Christmas gifts you will ever give anybody. And if someone this week is kind to you and welcoming for you and gracious and listens to you, don't forget to be incredibly grateful for the gift that they have given you. Go out and be somebody's Elizabeth. Be grateful for the Elizabeths in your life. And I bet there have been some in the past. Be grateful for those. And as a result of that, may your Advent be more blessed, more hopeful, more joyous as you take the steps to each of those days. Thanks be to God for Elizabeth, for Mary, and for Luke, who recorded this story for us.
Thanks for tuning in today. You've been listening to the Good News from the Corner podcast. St. John's Episcopal Church is located at the corner of Central and Greer in Memphis, Tennessee. Our parish website is www.stjohnsmemphis.org. You can also catch us on all of the normal social media platforms. You can join us for church at 10:30 on Sunday morning on our St. John's Memphis YouTube channel. Share the Good News podcast with somebody. And remember, you matter to God. Your life is not yours alone. Come see us sometime.